Hey folks, your OS Reviews. You're watching our throwback review of the LG G4. In this video, we'll be discussing whether this is still a worthwhile smartphone to pick up as we head into 2018. Currently, the price for a used G4 on Amazon or eBay is around $100 to $120, and for a device that doesn't come with a contract, that's a very low price, especially compared to its original retail cost of roughly $600 to $700. But for a flagship that came out 2 years ago, even if the performance holds up, there might be a larger reason why the G4's price has dropped so significantly. And part of that has to do with what's called the boot loop problem. That is, the phone has a known hardware problem that has been admitted by LG and hence is the subject of a current ongoing class action lawsuit where at some point the phones will eventually fail and then it won't boot up completely. It's going to stay stuck at the LG boot screen and it will repeatedly turn off, go back into the LG screen and loop in that cycle without ever entering into the home screen. That seems like a pretty dangerous flaw, and again, might be one of the reasons why, compared to phones that were released even in the same year, such as the Galaxy S6, the G4's price is so much lower now. However, let's take a closer look at its design and go over a few points before reaching an ultimate conclusion. Starting with the design, I think that the G4 still looks fairly elegant and classy. The phone is made predominantly out of plastic. There is the Corning Gorilla Glass 3 on the top here that has a slight curve to it. This was the same year that LG released the LG G Flex 2, which was kind of their second generation curved bendable phone. So the G4 employs a very slight curve as well, but nowhere near as noticeable. Otherwise, the phone's chassis is made entirely out of plastic, so this chrome accent unfortunately does attract a fair amount of kind of scratches and wear. It's not made out of metal, so it doesn't have quite the premium feel of HTC or even more current LG phones that's starting to use more aluminum in their construction. The back here does also have another curve that makes it very ergonomic to hold and grip, and it has this very interesting prism shape to the plastic panel, which can be swapped out and removed for something like leather if you wanted a more distinctive design. On the back, there is the classic kind of LG controls for the volume as well as the power. There's the two-tone LED flash. There is a 16-megapixel autofocus camera assisted with laser autofocus. And behind the back cover, you have access to a 3,000 milliamp hour capacity battery, which is replaceable. And that was one of the reasons why the G4 was celebrated at its time. For a flagship that had a removable cover meant you could easily swap out batteries and replace parts like the battery if needed. There's also the SIM card slot as well as the micro SD card to expand on the 32 gigs of built-in internal memory. On the very top of the phone, you find access to the IR blaster for remote control, and on the bottom, you have access to the speaker. Now, the speaker isn't very nicely placed. It's quite easy to muffle up, and the sound is definitely not the strongest suit of the G4, but nonetheless, it is what it is. The bottom also features a standard 3.5mm headphone jack, so yes, we still have a regular headphone on this particular device. So that's pretty much it. The phone itself, though, is a huge fingerprint magnet, as you can see here, and definitely attracts smudges very easily. The phone on the front has access to an 8-megapixel camera for taking selfies. There's the earpiece, there's a proximity light sensor, and there's just the LG logo. So overall, it remains pretty clean, and its sharp, angular looks were a departure from the G3's rounded corners. It reminds me almost of a blade in some ways, so it definitely seems very elegant and modern, even in 2017. So next, let's talk about the specs a little bit. As aforementioned, the 16-megapixel camera was a highlight at its time. Otherwise, the phone also has a Snapdragon 808 processor that's coupled with 3 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM. Spec-wise, 3 gigs of RAM is still completely fine. In fact, that still places it in the kind of upper middle tier to flagship level of RAM that we want to see, and the Snapdragon 808 on paper at least is still quite good. The G Flex 2, which had the Snapdragon 810, came out in the same year, although technically faster as an octa-core processor, had overheating issues, and performance significantly dropped when the phone got hot. So LG opted for the 808, which is a 6-core processor, and has a kind of dual-core 2.5 gigahertz main design, and it's supplemented by a quad-core, slightly less powerful architecture that is used, when the phone isn't performing such intensive tasks. And in general, it's still fairly snappy and responsive, but it's in no way comparable to more modern Snapdragon flagships like the A35, for instance. So the G4, as far as the hardware is concerned, does not have a fingerprint sensor, and this is one of the more modern features we've come to expect in the past few years. The G5 does, the G6 does. So if security is your #1 priority, then maybe the G4 isn't going to be the best bet anymore. But swiping open the screen, we do have access to kind of a very typical Android interface that has LG skin on top of it. It's pretty clean here, there isn't too much going on, but there is plenty of bloatware that, depending on the carrier, you'll see present. This one is by T-Mobile, so there's quite a few ads being displayed here. But getting past that point, the screen here is a 5.5-inch 4K display, so it houses a very impressive 1440 by 2560, and this gives it a very high pixel density above 500 ppi, so it's also very crisp and clean to look at. The display was significantly better than the LG G3 screen, which had muted colors, and more importantly, because of a slower processor and optimization, transitions seemed very choppy. On the G4, you can see that there has been improved snappiness, and everything just seems to flow a lot better, but more importantly, contrast has been punched up. It's using LG's kind of quantum dot technology. So the screen, even though it is a traditional LCD, performs very similar to something like an OLED or an AMOLED, with, again, very rich and vibrant colors, and overall, again, the display is a joy to use, and because it is so colorful, in addition to being pixel dense, it makes for a great multimedia experience. Moving into performance next, the G4 is still reasonably snappy. With that being said, there actually isn't a huge difference between this and what you might consider as a mid-end or even a budget smartphone in 2017. So again, I mentioned the Xiaomi Note 2. That's a pretty good example because it falls within the same kind of price range. You can get it new for about the same cost, and you get about the same level of smoothness. Now, the G4, despite having at the time a very flagship set of capabilities, was never really a true performance powerhouse. And I say that because if you had too many tabs open in the browser, if you were loading up a very complex page. So this is the New York Times, and you can see that if I scroll very quickly, there is a kind of a slight delay depending on what I'm flicking and what's going on with the transitions on screen. It's definitely not crippling, but it's not necessarily up to the expectations you may have, thinking, oh, the G4, it was a huge flagship, so therefore performance must be super snappy, must be super lucid. But that is not necessarily the case. Again, pretty comparable to most mid-tier phones you may have that are coming out new today. So that's something that you really should keep in mind. Same thing goes, with other elements that require the processor to come into play. So if you are a gamer and you want to play the most demanding titles, you'll experience the same things. Some slight dropped frames, and also if you have apps open in the background, a little bit of choppiness here and there. Now, the G4 does not have wireless charging, unfortunately, but it does have NFC. It has the standard Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, so connectivity is still pretty strong. And of course, there's 4G LTE here in the States. It's a quad-band GSM device if you pick it up with T-Mobile or AT&T, and of course CDMA if you use it with Sprint. So otherwise, call quality performance is also reasonably good. I would say that the speakerphone quality is decent, but again, it does get muffled up pretty easily. The microphone, however, is crystal clear and picks up your voice quite well. Reception quality also was fairly good here in the Bay Area. So as a phone, it still works very well. But again, you can see definitely, again, a little bit of sluggishness and slowdown. Even as you're kind of dialing numbers, you can see how there's a slight delay to where you tap on and before the animations catch up to your fingers. So again, it's not necessarily something that's gets away from the performance because everything still works. It's just not, again, crystal smooth to the same extent that you may expect from a flagship phone. But again, it's a 2-year-old flagship, so maybe these things are kind of expected at the end of the day. Google Essentials are all preloaded on here. You have access to Gmail, you have access to YouTube, Google Maps, and other services like Docs, Sheets, PowerPoints, Hangouts, things like that. The phone in the States is only updated to Android version 6.0, which is Marshmallow. Overseas, in countries like Korea, the phone is updated to 7.0 Nougat, but that update update, unfortunately, will not come by form of carrier support here in the US. You can still load Android 7.0 if you want to install the international firmware, but again, it's not something that everyone will be comfortable doing, and therefore, again, it's technically only 6.0. As Android Marshmallow becomes more popular heading into 2018, it is technically maybe 2 versions of Android behind, but that's not to say that it doesn't perform really well. All of your applications that you would want to download from the Play Store are still fully accessible, and there are no problems as far as running apps. But again, technically no longer the latest supported version of the software. Otherwise, let's now talk about the camera a little bit. Again, it was one of the highlights of the G4, and in 2017, it still is one of the better cameras on a phone. It features optical image stabilization, which means if you have shaky hands, if you're capturing images, it has a good tendency to try it and mitigate that shakiness by having the lens kind of float in its module. Furthermore, the camera snaps images very quickly, and that's also thanks to the laser-assisted autofocus. This is one of course, the benefits, and again, there was quite a lot of innovation going on. You can see how it instantly recognizes an object placed in front of it, and it's super swift as far as capturing images, and image quality itself is also good. 16 megapixels gives you a lot of detail to work with. Furthermore, the G4 has a manual mode which allows you to also capture raw images, so you can upload those to a computer, and you can look at uncompressed images with even more detail, and it's actually sufficiently clear to use even for professional settings. So it really is a great camera, and if you're just looking for a phone with okay capabilities but with a excellent camera, then the G4 is still a good use scenario, just because mid-end phones and budget phones in particular don't really have good camera quality, even new ones coming out in 2017. So that is one area where the G4 still stands up. So talking about the manual mode, you can see all of these settings, which are DSLR-like. You can change things like the autofocus, the white balance, the ISO settings, and you can change the flash settings as well. So all these things can be manually tweaked. If we zoom all the way in, you can see that details are definitely present, colors are well saturated, and the image quality is good. It's focused well. Of course, in 2016, one of the trends is dual camera setups, and that gives you kind of this mock depth sensing that allows you to create a bokeh effect on your images. But to be honest, for most folks out there, this camera really is good enough. And you can see that if you're tapping and focusing on objects close to the sensor, everything in the background already has a pretty natural kind of defocus to it. So again, a very good camera even in relative low light environments, especially you can see here in an outdoor kind of shot, your images are still fairly detailed and it captures a nice amount of light without blurring the shot. So it performs actually quite well. Part of that is again because of the larger kind of aperture of the lens. Taking a look at video playback through YouTube, this is a good opportunity to check out the keyboard. You can see this is the LG keyboard. It's not stock Android. It works pretty well. It has kind of a swipe-like filter pre-installed for quickly packing out words. And again, the phone is a 5.5-inch device. It doesn't come with the newest aspect ratio of 18:9, which is slightly slimmer and easier to hold with one hand. So people with smaller hands may find it more difficult to stretch all the way across. I still found the G4 to be fairly comfortable to hold. It doesn't have necessarily tiny bezels, but the bezels are reasonably slim for a phone that's from 2 years ago. And especially with the slight curve, I felt that navigating across the display wasn't a huge problem with even using one hand. So it doesn't necessarily feel like as big of a 5.5-inch phone as other 5.5-inch phones. So devices like the Oppo Find 7, which we reviewed a few years ago, that felt much larger, at least in my recollection. So when I picked up this phone at first, I thought, okay, maybe this has a 5.2-inch screen, maybe it has a closer to 5-inch screen than 5.5 inches, but I was wrong when I looked back at these specs. We can hear that the speaker quality, not bad. It's not muffled sounding, it's not kind of distorted sounding. And for a phone speaker, it actually does have a little bit of punch, a little bit of bass. But the thing about it is that it is a mono speaker. It's really easy to cover up if you're holding it, and it's definitely not as powerful as something that's front facing. So not the best audio experience, but thankfully there is a standard headphone port, so that is another saving grace. So at the end of the day, is the G4 a worthwhile phone here in 2017? If it was by the merits of performance and design alone, especially with its highlights like the camera, and at its very low price now of only $100 without a contract, I would say yes. But I still have to hesitate and probably argue for no, not for most folks. At the end, just because of the boot loop problem. And this is an issue that is very common. You can simply search on Google and it will pull up pages and pages of complaints of forums and temporary hacks that people have tried to fix a boot loop once it has popped up. And those hacks may include baking the phone in an oven, submerging it in a freezer, disassembling it, and then using a hair dryer to blow on the circuit board. And these are all things that again paint a very dangerous image and just seem unacceptable, I guess, for most consumers to try and do. So with such common problems, it's really hard to recommend the phone because you simply don't know when the issue will pop up. It seems like a constant. You don't know if it's going to appear today, tomorrow, or in a month. So with this type of risk at hand, again, it is hard to justify the device even if it runs still pretty well and has a low price point. Again, ultimately, I would point you at the direction of maybe even perhaps an older phone like the LG G3, which has very similar specifications but does not encounter that boot loop problem. So it certainly seems, reflecting back on history, that 2015 was a pretty rough year for LG on many of their flagships, starting with the G Flex 2, ending with the G4, the V10, that all encountered this unfortunate problem, all stemming from the processor overheating. So thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews. This has been a look-back review of the LG G4 as we head into 2018.